Hello there! So, the ranking criteria is like a basic mapper's handbook telling us what our maps are allowed to do through some basic rules and guidelines. How do you think each point on the ranking criteria should be written? I imagine most people would say something along the lines of, rules should be as concise and clear as possible with no wiggle room for avoidance or misinterpretation. Makes sense, you wouldn't want people to circumvent a mapping problem just because of a writing loophole. Like, the first rule in the OSU standard ranking criteria states that objects must never be off-screen in 4:3 aspect ratios. If there were more room for interpretation here by, say, removing the 4:3 aspect ratio part, we'd see chaos. Hello, Mr. Mapper. I think your slider is off-screen. No, it's not. Don't you play OSU with a dual monitor setup? Seriously, it's perfectly on-screen, see? Sounds absurd, but this rule set controls rankability and the slider technically abides by this rule, so it's okay. Or it would be without the 4:3 thing. That's why rules are so wordy and specific sometimes, to avoid even minor misconceptions and abuse. Sometimes though, I think that specificity can actually turn around and lead to more problems. One outstanding example of this came from a rule that was part of the ranking criteria until not too long ago about perfectly overlapping slider bodies. This is the OSU standard ranking criteria from a few years ago. It includes a rule saying every slider must have a clear and visible path to follow from start to end, and it provides some examples of what's unacceptable like barrage sliders and this. When going through the process of revamping the ranking criteria at the beginning of this year, it was decided that this rule would carry over into the updated version. It's only natural. I mean, how would you feel about sight reading a newly ranked map to the end, only to get your combo broken by something unfair and out of your control? It's stupid, so keeping the rule in the ranking criteria to prevent stuff like that seemed like a good choice. After a few rounds of revision and general acceptance from the community, it was time to amend the new ranking criteria to the wiki and replace the outdated one. A concern rose about this rule upon finalization, though. Does every OSU player have the same understanding of what a clear and visible slider path is? That's what those involved in writing the ranking criteria were asked, and there was no straightforward answer. Up until this point, what was considered a readable slider was determined by common sense and practical judgment, but for the ranking criteria's update, that wouldn't pass. It could end up in the same situation as an off-screen object thing. Someone could say a slider is unreadable, while someone else could say otherwise, and the vague rule would have no bearing over who's correct. It was decided that the already listed examples were good enough for single slider body readability, but to account for sliders that overlap each other, a new sentence was added for clarification. When perfectly overlapping two slider bodies, the first slider must be fully faded out before the second slider is fully faded in. That was a last-minute attempt at objectifying what a clear slider path is when two overlapping sliders are involved. Because this change was done during finalization though, it didn't receive proper community input, and looking back on it now, anyone could tell you it was short-sighted. Perfectly overlapping two slider bodies refers to anything like this. If one slider's entire body and tail are below another slider, you can't tell at a glance that it's actually a slider. Sure, the body color is more saturated, but you'd most likely not even notice that during gameplay since there's a gradual fade. The approach circle is what you'd focus on, and without a new slider body to follow, it's more natural to assume this is a circle, easily resulting in an unfair misread. The first slider must be fully faded out. You could just eyeball this, but if you want to be precise, you can hover over a slider body and see its anchors. At 240 milliseconds after a slider ends, the anchors are visible, while at 241 milliseconds, they're gone, meaning that's exactly when the slider is fully faded out. Before the second slider is fully faded in. A slider is fully visible 400 milliseconds after it starts fading in, so subtracting 400 from approach rate fade-in values gives you how long a slider is fully visible before it's played. At AR9, that's about 200 milliseconds. So when you've got one slider fully covered by another, you've got to take 240 milliseconds for the fade out of the first slider and add that AR minus 400 millisecond value for the second slider's fade in. On an AR9 map, two sliders like this 440 milliseconds apart would be the baseline for what's acceptable. The time difference here makes for readable perfectly overlapped sliders according to the ranking criteria. While this was designed to be a precise rule with minimal room for loopholes, it's hard to say it even worked well at that. I doubt more than a handful of people reading the new ranking criteria went through the trouble of figuring out these stats because they're way more complex than necessary. Just eyeballing it is more practical, assuming you can even understand what the sentence says. What contradicted its intent more so though was a definition of perfectly overlapping sliders. As said earlier, something like this where the body and tail are fully underneath another slider is considered perfectly overlapping, which makes it sound like two sliders that are not perfectly overlapping are readable and okay according to the ranking criteria. For example, this is a partial overlap. Even though the second half is covered completely, you can assume both sliders end at the same position because otherwise the tail would be visible through the transparent body. Like this. You can read it too because it's only partially obscured. Both would be rankable according to the rule because you can't possibly interpret them as circles. Things get a bit more confusing with stuff like this. Does the second slider end here or here? Only possible to tell once the first slider has begun fading out, at which point you're given a really small window of time to react in. In this example, it ends below the first slider's head, but a few seconds later in the map, it's below the first slider's tail. Both would be rankable under this rule because they show parts of slider bodies, even though the overlapped parts are still ambiguous. The paths kind of aren't clear, but they're not perfectly overlapping, so they're okay. Then, taking that logic to the extremes with placements like this just defeated the point of the rule. You won't misinterpret this as a circle because part of the slider is uncovered. See, there's a tiny bit of slider body visible between 1 and 2, making it not perfectly overlapping, and therefore acceptable according to the ranking criteria. At least if this were in the other direction, you could see a slider tail and know for sure there's a slider underneath, but that's something else entirely. So, by drawing a clear line for what types of slider body overlaps are readable, a can of worms was opened up by mappers treading on the edge of that line. While this rule was in place, I saw lots of maps focusing on these barely not overlapping object placements just because it was considered rankable, whereas before the rule, few people even thought about it. The precise wording of this rule encouraged a lot of hard-to-read slider overlaps, and therefore countered its own purpose. Well, in that way it did. In other ways, it did the opposite, marking ways of mapping as unreadable and therefore unrankable, even though they could potentially be fine under the right circumstances. For example, this map uses perfectly overlapping sliders pretty much everywhere. Object 3 is entirely concealed under Object 1, and it's fully faded in before 1 fully fades out. It's unreadable according to the rule. But in reality, is it? 3 being shorter than 1 makes a hidden slider kind of obvious. As soon as 1 starts fading out, you can see that only part of it disappears and understand there's a second slider underneath. Plus, this pattern is literally the first thing you see when playing the map. If you can't figure it out, you restart, and if you continue playing anyway, you'll encounter it again and again until you comprehend what's going on. The perfectly overlapping slider bodies rule assumes mappers are retarded. To pull off a map with hard-to-read elements, a mapper can introduce its concepts early on and let players get used to it for the rest of the map. That's basic map design. Because it's not possible to objectify well-introduced concepts in the ranking criteria though, the rule here assumes everyone using hard-to-read sliders will do so poorly. It avoids this potential slider readability issue by disallowing it on all maps, including the ones that could perform well, like the example here. So as you could probably guess, not many people were in support of this rule. Everyone thought it had problems, including those who worked on the ranking criteria, and so after a long wait and some community outcry, the rule was removed and shifted over to the guidelines. This means mappers can now go against the guideline with their perfectly overlapping sliders, so long as they have a solid reason. Was this change for the better? Yeah, but I think it may have also had some unintended side effects. Well, really, including the rule at all was the problem. Removing this sentence from the rules section signaled to mappers and modders that perfectly overlapping slider bodies were okay now, so instead of being critical of this type of placement, people kinda just considered it fine. Before this precise rule-turned guideline even existed, however, people were required to use their own judgment to figure out whether or not perfectly overlapping slider bodies were acceptable. Going by the old rule, people had to interpret whether or not a slider was obscured to the point of having an unclear path. Hard to believe, but people had to actually think for themselves and use common sense, rather than reading off part of the wiki to justify their choices. That mindset could make things frustrating because of disagreements, but it also prevents what I'm seeing a lot of now as a result of the rule being gone. I've seen some maps using perfectly overlapping sliders in, personally speaking, not so readable ways, and it's hard to really criticize them because the ranking criteria says it's no longer strictly unrankable. This sentence has become how people judge overlaps, and nobody enforces guidelines as it should be. And don't get me wrong, the rule sucked. I agree it was too restrictive, complex, and plain ineffective at determining unfair readability. I just don't like the idea of people saying any out-of-place overlaps are okay because the ranking criteria doesn't consider it a rule anymore. Just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But yeah, that's what I wanted to get across here. Leaving no room for interpretation in the ranking criteria isn't always the best decision. For clearly definable stuff like off-screen objects, yeah, that's the right way, but for stuff like slider design, which can vary in infinite ways, leaving it somewhat vague might actually be the better choice. More generally put, letting people determine what's okay based on their own understanding of mapping is more reasonable than letting the ranking criteria replace thinking. Instead of blindly following rules and flippantly ignoring guidelines, think about what they're saying and maybe apply that to your map. So that's about it. This perfectly overlapping slider bodies rule has been a guideline as of November 15th, so stuff like this is now technically rankable. Just be sure you handle them well or else I'll be sad. And I'll take you down with me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.